big issue in this election campaign, and really over the last few years, has been asylum seekers. Now, Kevin Rudd, we know you went to the 2007 election promising to dismantle the Pacific Solution. We know there was popular support for doing that, and you did it. But with the benefit of hindsight, do you, along with many others who have done, now acknowledge that was wrong?
As I answer that, one concluding point on the previous discussion.
Let's move on if we can.
No, I just want to say this. If you're not going to change the GST, why is it subject to the tax review by the alternative government?
I'm sure we'll pursue the economy a little later in our question.
You legitimately raised the question, David, of asylum seekers. This is a very difficult question for the country, and the activities of people smugglers concern all Australians. You're right, in 2007 we had a mandate. We implemented that mandate, and then our external circumstances, as you know, during the course of 2008, 9 and 10 changed. There were many things which happened in the international community, including a civil war in Sri Lanka. So what I have said on many times already is that with the benefit of 2020 hindsight, you would have begun to adjust the policy earlier. Our policy now
with that hindsight, you also acknowledge you should not have done what you did in dismantling the Pacific Solution.
I believe in acting according to your democratic mandate. That was what we took to the people supported it. And I would say this about the so-called Pacific Solution. Let us just put that under one moment's scrutiny, given you've just raised it. The truth about the Pacific Solution is that 70%, thereabouts, of those people sent by Mr Howard to Nauru and elsewhere as part of the Pacific Solution used it as a way station, and then within a couple of years were in Australia anyway. It was not a durable response. What I've put forward is a new policy for the future with one simple principle attached. If you're a people smuggler bringing someone to Australia and you are seeking to settle them in Australia, we will not allow them to be settled here. They'll be sent for processing in Papua New Guinea, and if they're proven to be bona fide refugees, settled in Papua New Guinea.
Tony Abbott, what is wrong? What is your problem with this current policy? We know you've been very critical about Labor's chopping and changing on this and the number of people who've come, but what is actually wrong with this current policy?
Well, we will salvage what we can from the arrangements that Mr Rudd has made with PNG, and let's face it, we invented offshore processing. The coalition invented processing at Nauru. The coalition invented processing at Manus Island.
Is there anything wrong with the current policy?
And Mr Rudd closed it all down, and it's because Mr Rudd closed it all down that we've had more than 50,000 illegal arrivals, more than 800 boats, $11 billion in budget blowouts, and tragically more than 1,000 deaths at sea. It's important to get the facts straight here, David. We will salvage what we can of the PNG solution, but the PNG solution is not what the Prime Minister says it is. He says no one who goes to PNG will ever come to Australia. That's not what the document says, and I understand that today we had 2 Somalis come across the Torres Strait. So, look, I'm not saying offshore processing isn't important, but on its own, it's not enough.
Well, you also want to turn back boats where it's safe to do so. Can you explain tonight for us exactly what you would do if a boat tries to enter Australian waters?
If it's safe to do so, as advised by the operational commanders on the ground, it will be turned around. Now, there's no mystery to this. This is not some unprecedented action. The Australian Navy, for more than a decade, has been dealing with pirate boats in the Persian Gulf. The US Coast Guard, for more than 2 decades, has been turning around boats in the Caribbean coming from Cuba to Florida. The Australian Navy did it several times successfully before.
Do you think this really would spark some sort of conflict with Indonesia?
I think the first point to make about it is that when Mr Abbott says when it's safe, the truth is the operational command given by people smugglers to those boats is this. If the Australian Navy or anyone else tries to turn your boat around, scuttle a ship. And under those circumstances, people then drown. And under international maritime law, what then happens is that the nearest ship is required to go and rescue. That's the problem, the key operational problem. If we didn't think that problem exists, we'd have a different approach. And secondly, it is in direct contrast and conflict with the stated policy of the government of Indonesia.
So you think it would lead to conflict?
I go back to one other point, David, and that is that Mr Abbott, in pointing to this halcyon past, the Pacific solution, has not answered the core question. 70% of the people who went to Nauru ended up in Australia as permanent residents later. Well, if it's not true, what is the number then? And I'd really appreciate some clarification of that.
Well, as your own former Minister, Senator Evans, made clear, 30% went home, 30% went to a country other than Australia, and yes, 40% did come to Australia, but the Prime Minister owes it to the Australian people to get his facts right, not to invent them, and the boats stopped. That's the key point.
All right,
the boats stopped. Since the PNG solution,
we want to move to today's
we've had more than 2,000 illegal arrivals. Less than 200 have actually gone to PNG.
Let's get to our first question from our panel of journalists. It's from the ABC's Lyndall Curtis.
Thank you, David. A question to Mr Rudd, but to you too, Mr Abbott, on the issue of trust. Mr Rudd, you're suggesting the Coalition would raise a tax, but in the past 6 years, the Labor government has raised a number of taxes or charges or levies. Recently, you raised a tax a little more than a week ago. Mr Abbott, you've criticised the Labor Party for not taking policies to an election, for implementing them without taking them to people, but you'd implement recommendations of your Audit Commission that you deem to be within your mandate without putting them before the people. Why should people trust you when you criticise the other side for doing something you do yourself?
Are you putting this question to me first and then to Mr Abbott? Let's go to a very basic measure here. You talk about the tax impost on Australians. Under this government, the tax to GDP ratio has, in the period that we've been in office, an average of 22.7%. Under the Coalition, the average for the period they were in office was 25.1%. That's a big difference. It's a huge difference. And therefore, the whole premise of the argument that this government is overtaxing the Australian people really has to be tested against the facts. The other thing I'd say is that with income tax cuts, we have rolled out 3 years' worth of those, and they have had a benefit to families in Australia under financial pressure. There is always more to do on tax, but on tax policy I'd also say this. If Mr Abbott is in the business of rolling out proposed tax cuts for the company rate of 1.5% and abolishing the mining tax, well, they are tax cuts which benefit very large corporations in the main. They don't do a lot for small business, particularly the unincorporated ones. And further to that, if the way of offsetting that for ordinary Australian families is to hold open the possibility of a review of the goods and services tax, I don't think there's a lot of equity in that. So our record on tax as a proportion of the economy is a strong one, introducing personal income tax cuts which benefit families under financial pressure. Mr Abbott seems to be heading in the reverse direction for big companies and mining companies who frankly have enjoyed high levels of profitability for a long period of time.
Well, if I could just, Lyndall, remind the Prime Minister and viewers at home of the words of the former Prime Minister, Ms Gillard, who said in the Parliament in early 2012, if you're against cutting the company tax, you're against jobs. And the words of the former Treasury Secretary, Dr Henry, who said that the principal beneficiaries of any company tax cut are workers. So our company tax cut, our carbon tax cuts are designed to increase jobs, to improve job security and to help people with their cost of living. Abolishing the carbon tax will mean a $550 a year saving for the average household. As for the Commission of Audit, well, it's not a tax review. It's a review into the size, scope and efficiency of government, and we wouldn't implement any recommendations that we felt were contrary to a mandate.
Our next question comes from Peter Harcher.
Mr Rudd, you were talking just now. This question is for you, but I'd also be interested in Mr Abbott's thoughts. Mr Rudd, you're talking about the relatively small size of the tax revenue take in the economy. And indeed, since the last election, the Labor government has revised downwards, has cut on 6 separate occasions its forecast of tax revenue. It's got to the point where the former Treasury Secretary, whom Mr Abbott cited a minute ago, Ken Henry, has said what we see is a structural change in the ability of the economy to produce tax revenues. Ken Henry has said that any government, any incoming government, whether it's led by you or Mr Abbott, will be forced into a permanent process, and that's quoting Ken Henry, a permanent process of cutting spending. So my question to you, Mr. Rudd, but also interested in your thoughts, Mr. Abbott, what programs will you cut? And if you're not going to cut any programs, what taxes will you increase?
On the question of tax, I would simply reiterate one point I made before. In a perfect world, you would be able to reduce the company tax rate. But as many others have said recently in response to Mr. Abbott's proposal, that is not the right course of action at this time in the history of our economy. We face a whole bunch of new challenges. I referred to those before in my opening remarks. Therefore, what Mr. Abbott's proposal does is, in fact, remove two significant slices of revenue from the government, and I fear transfers that burden potentially to families in terms of any future change to the goods and services tax.
Mr. Abbott has in mind, but what programs would you cut or what taxes would you increase so that you don't have to...
On the question of our approach to managing our budget, I've got to say we have produced in full an economic statement only a week or so ago which details our approach both to how we're managing on the tax side and what we're doing as far as expenditure is concerned as well. And this returns the budget to surplus responsibly over time without engaging in massive, major cuts which have a danger of throwing the economy into recession. We will always keep an open mind in terms of how we manage expenditures in the future, but economic wisdom right now lies not in cutting things to the bone, jobs, education, health, is if you do that, not only are those people going to be hurt badly at a time when there's global economic softness, but on top of that, you're going to create real problems down the track in terms of, frankly, keeping the economy going. One other point I'd just add is this. If you're going to talk about growing revenues in the future, what we must do is boost the productivity of our businesses, and that is why we are investing in one of the greatest productivity enhancers in the future for businesses, including small business, and that is broadband to everybody, which we know from studies boosts their overall profitability over time.
Mr. Abbott.
Well, look, on the broadband, on the national broadband network, it's way behind schedule, it's way over budget, and we are absolutely convinced, based on expert advice, that we can produce 5 times present average maximum download speeds for $60 billion less. We can get 25 megabits per second everywhere in Australia by 2016. At the current rate of rollout, the national broadband network won't cover the whole country for 20 years. Now, on, Peter, your fundamental question, yes, revenues are under pressure, no doubt about that. What we need to do is grow a stronger economy. That's why it's so important to reduce unnecessary taxes, eliminate unnecessary taxes like the carbon tax and the mining tax, which have damaged confidence, and reduce red tape. Mr. Rudd talks about productivity, but his last speech at the National Press Club, which talked about productivity, in the end, what did it all add up to? Establishing a committee. There were no specific plans that would actually boost productivity. Well, reducing red tape boosts productivity, restoring the workplace relations pendulum to the sensible centre, that increases productivity, re-establishing the Australian Building and Construction Commission, that increases productivity, and that will give our country the stronger economy that we need if we are to have well-funded education, well-funded health and well-funded disability systems in the years ahead.
Okay, the question was actually what programs are you willing to cut? I don't think we've heard any from either of you, but Tony Abbott, you are willing to cut the school kids bonus still, aren't you?
Look, as we've said all along, this is a cash splash with borrowed money that has nothing to do with education. Okay. Now, the letters are already going out, as I understand it, from the Labor Party. Yet another scare campaign from the Labor Party. I am being honest and upfront with people. We can't afford it at this time. What you'll get from Mr. Rudd and from the Labor Party, promises made before an election, scrapped after an election. We already had suggestions from one of the panellists tonight, Simon Benson, that the government was looking at abolishing the school kids bonus. It was an article, Simon, you published, I think, on the 26th of July in the Daily Telegraph.
Well, let's just clear that up. Is that staying?
Well, I think let's just level here about what the alternatives are. We believe that families across Australia are under significant cost of living pressures. One measure we've taken is to increase the childcare rebate from 30 to 50%. Another measure we've taken is to ensure that kids who are at school supporting their families receive a school kids bonus. That's committed. That's in the Ford estimates. It's there, and we're already paying it. And that's $410 a year for a primary school kid, $820 a year for a secondary school kid. And that, I believe, helps relieve some of the pressure faced by working families. I go back to the tax and spend question, which was raised by Peter Hartcher before. What I see from Mr Abbott's side of the argument is a series of actions to reduce the taxation burden on big companies and in the mining sector. And I worry about families and where it goes to them, particularly with the GST.
Let's move on. Our next question comes from Simon Benson.
Right. This may not come as a surprise to either of you, this question. Both of you have promised a productivity drive to re-energise the economy and to create jobs. And both of you are aware of successive government reports that tell you that the greatest boost to the nation's productivity, one which could create up to 50,000 jobs over time, could be achieved by building a second international airport at Badgerys Creek. Now, I want to pose this question first to you, Mr Abbott, and forgive me for being blunt.
Sure.
But surely, after 30 years of debate, it is time to act in the nation's economic interests and just build the bloody thing.
Well, Simon, I accept that we do need to do something about airport capacity serving Sydney. I absolutely accept that. We cannot go on for another decade the way we have over the last 6 years, and we've had a government which has not advanced us 1 inch, 1 yard over the last 6 years on this. Just a few weeks ago, the Infrastructure Minister said that a decision would be made in the next term. Well, I will make a decision on this in a term of government, should I get it. The first thing you've got to do, though, this is the first thing you've got to do, is to improve the infrastructure surrounding the existing Sydney airport, which is clogged at peak periods, completely clogged. That will boost the capacity of the existing Sydney airport. That's why I'm so determined to build WestConnex. It will happen under the coalition. It won't happen under Mr Rudd. And if you take the pressure off major roads, you take the pressure off the feeder roads as well.
So you have committed to make a decision, match that commitment, to make a decision in the next term of government. All right. Prime Minister, your response?
Let me answer this in 2 ways, because I think it answers 2 parts of Simon's question. He talked about productivity, then specifically about Sydney Airport. Can I just make the point on productivity? Under the Fair Work Act, it's really important. Labour productivity actually has been growing at 1.9%. Under work choices, it was 0.7%. Let's just bear that in mind before everyone assumes that somehow the Fair Work Act is counter to productivity outcomes. The second point I'd make is this. Productivity is driven by a whole bunch of things. It's driven by relative energy prices, including the burden being faced by a whole bunch of people through gouging by state government-owned electricity utilities as well. That brings down the relative competitiveness and efficiency and productivity of firms. The level of skills that we're investing in for firms, that drives productivity. That's why we are so passionate about our investment in education. Furthermore, our investment in infrastructure, enabling infrastructure, like the National Broadband Network, goes to all of Australia, not just to Sydney, Simon, and therefore that also is capable of lifting the productivity of firms. These are the drivers of productivity. We're passionate about that. On Sydney Airport, there's a massive debate about where any second airport should be. I'm from Queensland. I'm not from Sydney. I hear contending arguments in terms of where or if such a new airport should be located. This lies with the Infrastructure Minister. I'm sure recommendations will come forward at the right time and that appropriate decisions will be made on when the existing site at Kingsford Smith reaches its capacity. But I go back to the productivity drivers. That is a much broader equation for all Australians. And therefore, it's got to be investing in people's skills, investing in the new infrastructure and making sure we've got competitive energy prices. Like, for example, bringing on new gas supplies to bring down the energy price like in the United States.
You did say when, you did say when and if. Are you saying there's some question mark over whether Sydney needs a second airport?
I'll defer that question to those, for example, Minister Albanese, the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister for Transport, because that is how it's appropriately deliberated on. I don't believe...
It needs leadership though, PM.
Oh, but hang on. I'd hate again to say to the good folk of Sydney that theirs is not the only airport in the country. There's one in Brisbane, there's one in Melbourne, and if the argument which Simon put was about productivity, I'm just making a pretty forthright argument that it's the efficiency of our port infrastructure, in which we've massively invested, the efficiency of our rail networks we're massively investing in, and Mr Abbott is saying he won't ever invest in a urban rail network, and we've currently got billions going into Brisbane, Redcliffe Rail, into other projects around the country, including Melbourne with the Regional Rail Express.
We got the list from both of you on various projects.